Species interactions. In this lecture, we'll talk about a bunch of different types of interactions between species in different populations interacting. We have competition, predation, amensalism, commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. In the little pluses or minuses or zeros in the parentheses there, meaning in the two species that are interacting, we just break it down to the smallest subset of that. Any kind of interaction is one species interacting with another. These are the possible outcomes. A dash or a negative mark means one species is harmed. A plus means that species benefits. A zero means there's neutral effects. So in competition, both species are harmed in some way, like their resources diminish. It doesn't have to be a major way they're harmed, but somehow it reduces their fitness and survival for competition. So there's a negative negative. It's a lose-lose kind of thing, ecologically speaking. Predation, one of the species interacting benefits, and the other one, it's detrimental to them. In amensalism, one is harmed and the other has no effect. Commensalism is an interaction where one species benefits and there's neutral effects on the other party. A mutualism is a win-win where both species, while they're interacting, benefit. Parasitism, one benefits, one's harmed. And we're going to move on and go into detail on each of those. Before we get into those 6 different types of species interactions, I wanted to share with you this quote from Frank Egler, a plant ecologist that lived a while ago. He said, "Nature is not more complicated than you think. It's more complicated than you can think." And I like that a lot because it tells us a couple of things. And one is the number of interactions between different species and between species and the environment is so complex. And there's so many that we can never even understand how many and the nature of those interactions. And so we need to kind of be humble about that, realize that we can't even understand it, even if we tried all our lives. But we can try, and the more of these species interactions that we can think of and bring into our consciousness and our awareness while we're trying to do restoration, the better it is. The more we know about them and include those interactions in our land management or species conservation, the better our success rate will be. So he knew about these and he shared that quote with us. He's kind of become popular from that quote. And the first one we'll talk about is competition. So imagine 2 species, they're different species, and they're interacting somehow. When they compete, they're competing for, could be a number of things, could be resources, could be space. If they're from the same species, 2 individuals competing within the same species, they could be competing over mates. So competition, in its technical sense, how it's viewed in ecology is both species are harmed. And again, not meaning somehow they're wounded. It just means their ability to acquire those resources and survive and reproduce is diminished somewhat. Let's look at some more detailed examples. Here's a couple different types of competition. Intraspecific is when 2 individuals from the same species are competing. These are showing you examples of seagulls, deer, rhinoceros. So they're the same species, but in all cases, well, the rhinos, we can just assume maybe they are fighting over competing for territorial thing, or it could be mates. Probably not food, but I'm just guessing. I'm not a rhinocerosologist. A deer, it's kind of a mating season kind of competition. The seagulls are probably fighting over French fries they found at a restaurant, so food source. Interspecific, like interstate highways go between different highways, and intrastate highways are within one state. The interspecific competition is 2 different species competing for something. You've got a lion and a hyena, looks like a hyena with a strange eye, fighting over some food. And you have a zebra and a water buffalo fighting, not, they're not fighting, but they're both using the same resource of water. And in a sense, that would be competition too, because they're both utilizing the same resource, meaning diminishing the quantity or availability of that resource somewhat, just by them, say the water buffalo drinking some of the water diminishes the amount available for the zebra. So that's considered in this sense a negative for them both to be using the same resource. And then we have rabbits and giraffes. I don't know why all these things are always using African animals. We could do a squirrel and a chipmunk, something more local, but these somehow, because they're exotic, stand out in our brains even more, except for the seagulls, the rats of the sky. Here's just some text that is reiterating what I said in the last slide: intraspecific and interspecific competition, distinguishing those two. Under interspecific, you can have exploitation competition or interference. In exploitation, competition is over a shared resource that's in short supply. So each population of those two species, different species, are negatively affected due to the decrease in the resource caused by the acquisition by the other, like the zebra and the water buffalo both drinking the water. That's exploitation. It's almost like tragedy of the commons in animals. No one's in charge. One's going to try to get as much as it can, not thinking about the other species. So the other type is interference, and that's actually the more interesting for us humans to watch this, but competition in which the negative effect is due to an organism's interference. It somehow is preventing the other species from getting that resource. And we see that sometimes here and there. Sometimes it's in plants or in insects, animals too, where one species will try to divert that other species from getting the resource that they both need. And that's interference. It looks, and I think it's more interesting to people because it looks a little bit more like human social behavior, where like the difference between, have you ever heard of this, which is a tangent, but envy is kind of like you want what someone else has, but jealousy is where you don't just want what they have, but you want them not to have it. That would be more like interference. You do something to prevent them from getting that. When ecologists started to study these interactions, and by the way, these types of interactions were first really looked at in depth when the field of ecology came to be back in the late 50s and 60s, 1960s, and it really became more of a solidified discipline in the 1970s. But so when these ecologists started looking at, well, okay, we have this idea of competition and what it can do to each species, and to determine if competition is happening, especially if something like plants, you have two plants out in a field, or let's say in the desert. I'll tell you about a study in just a minute. And you're saying, are these plants just both utilizing the rain whenever it comes, or the nutrients, or are they competing for that resource? Like, what is competition in something that's not obvious, like a lion and a hyena, something that's much less obvious? So to determine if it's happening, the researchers would look, is there some pattern first that suggests competition? Maybe. Identify the resources shared between the two species, and then demonstrate or document that shared resource is limiting. So if there's less of it, the population's size and survival and fitness and reproduction would decrease. And then fourth, document that negative impact of each population on the other from use of that shared resource. Some manipulative experiments that isolate above or below ground competition in plants have been used, and were some of the first to show that yes, there is some competition between plants over different resources. The next slide shows an example of creosote and burrow bush in the Mojave Desert. So in this early kind of thought of as a classic study in plant competition, Fontaine and Mayhall produced, they created this study and carried it out and published it in the Journal of Ecology in 1978 and another related article in 1981, where they looked at the creosote bush and the burrow bush in these large, relatively uniform Mojave Desert community, creosote bush community, where there was a lot of both of those species. There were other species too. They took these big areas and they sectioned it off, and in some of those areas they removed one or the other of those shrubs to look at how they grew and their response to being not with the other species in these large 100-meter square plots. And then they measured the water status of the plants that were not removed, the ones still remaining, and as a measure of release from competition for soil moisture. So they were looking at competition for water, a great place to do it in the desert, where water is very limiting and limited. And so what they saw in the results that when burrow bush was removed in some plots, the creosote or Lauria competition with other Lauria had little effect on the water plant status. So Lauria, when there was only the creosote bush, that's the Lauria, it didn't really have a big effect. They still had the same amount of water in their bodies, of the body of the plant. But when they released ambrosia from competition with other ambrosia plants, it did affect water status. The ambrosia did better when the other ambrosias weren't there and there was the creosote bush. So it means that some plants are competing. This ambrosia is competing with other ambrosia plants, not with the creosote bush, but within the intraspecific competition was happening for water. That's how they isolated. Some of these interactions that I just described were not competitive, like in the Lauria, but in the ambrosia, there was some, and that was between Lauria bushes. So we have all these interactions happening, and those interactions and how they affect the different species involved in those interactions is determined by other factors that are intricately tied into these interactions, like resource availability. One of the factors that determines the range of the species, so where they can grow, how far and how close they are together, and the full distribution of them on the land, is the law of the minimum, and sometimes called Liebig's law of the minimum. And that reads, the distribution of a species will be controlled by that factor for which the organism has the narrowest range of adaptability or control. Think again of these creosote bushes in the desert. So water could be that environmental factor, and it is the thing is the biggest driver in the range and distribution of those creosote bushes, where they can grow. So let's say if there was not a lot of rain and you added a lot of nitrogen or phosphorus and there wasn't much rain, it still wouldn't change the growth of that plant. Water is that limiting factor. That's the thing that's the most scarce factor, is going to be controlling the range and the growth of that species. That's what this law means. So another factor that determines the range of species and where they can exist and where they can't, that can also connect with and influence competition, is what's called the law of tolerance, or Shelford's law of tolerance. This guy looks pretty serious, Dr. Shelford there. That is, the distribution of a species is controlled by the environmental factor for which the species has the narrowest tolerance. So species all have their tolerances of certain environmental conditions. That they can't survive below a certain amount of, maybe say, heat or cold, or a certain nutrient is too low, and they also have a maximum tolerance level for that environmental condition. Could be sunlight, and they have an optimum one too, so somewhere kind of in the middle, their sweet spot. But they do have, they can be tolerant only to a point, and beyond that, that will prevent that species from being there or succeeding. A local example that some of you are familiar with is the salt marsh bird's beak. It's like a clover family plant that's an endangered, federally endangered and state endangered plant that lives in the Carp Salt Marsh and a few other marshes throughout southwestern coastal US and Mexico. So this, the tolerance here, the reason this thing is growing at this highest kind of points in a salt marsh is that that has the least amount of ocean tidal inundation. It's the last and the least area to get inundated by ocean water, and it's the salt, the salinity of that water, which prevents that bird's beak from growing lower. If it could handle saltier water, even just a little saltier, it could grow lower and be more widespread, but it can't. So that's its tolerance level, which makes it only appear on the tops of these higher spots in a salt marsh. That would be the law of tolerance is driving the distribution of this. Another early ecologist, Gauss, came up with the idea of competitive exclusion. It's Gauss's principle, and it says that two species, different species, that are complete competitors, meaning they use the same exact niche or the same resources, the same space, the same foods, everything is the same. He's saying if they're complete competitors, meaning in every way they compete, they have the exact same needs, then they cannot coexist in the same space. So you would not find those two together sharing that resource. They have to be separated somehow. So complete competitors cannot coexist. He also said, part of this principle, two species with the same niche cannot coexist. It's kind of saying the same thing as A. And transitively, one species has only one niche. Now, a little bit backwards, but let's define niche. You might have heard that before. It kind of means like an animal's habitat. A little bit more than that, though. So it's an organism's role in the community, the conditions under which it can live, the resources it consumes, the habitats and microhabitats it utilizes. So it's the physical niche, like where it, a bird, like where it nests and where it gets its food and where it hides and all that kind of stuff, as well as its relational niche, other species it interacts with, etc. So there's more to it than just the physical niche. And that goes back to Gauss's principle that two, let's say birds, if they have the exact same niche, the same area, the same foods and all, that according to this, they would not be found together, coexisting. They could exist, but in different places. Hutcheson, shown in the image when he was 18, another great early ecologist, pulled that or defined it even further between, okay, we have niches, but there's also a fundamental niche that's a set of resources and conditions that permits the survival and reproduction of an organism. And there's a realized niche, the portion of the fundamental niche actually occupied by the species. And this comes into restoration in play in the sense that if we have a species that is endangered and protected by the Endangered Species Act, but it could be that there's it's on private land and the person wants to develop some of that land and maybe destroy some of those species. A mitigation might be required by the National Environmental Policy Act or CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And that would require, okay, if you're going to actually destroy some of this endangered species population, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would kind of broker this agreement. Then you have to restore a population of that species somewhere else if you're going to, kind of no net loss. And what you would use, what you would look at is Hutcheson's fundamental niche. So look for other areas that are the same habitat, the same resources, same soils, etc., but that endangered species isn't there, meaning its potential habitat. It looks really good for that species. Somehow the seeds of that endangered species, if we're talking about plants, or propagules, meaning babies, etc., haven't gotten to that spot, but it's good habitat for that endangered species. So that's what would be an example of how those two definitions and delineations of niche could help in some kind of conservation plan. And
They have in many times, especially in restoration, where a lot of restoration focuses on replacing the land, the contours and the soil and the plants first. And you would just want to make sure that that area is suitable for those plants, that it's actually a fundamental niche for those plants. And then once the plants are established, usually that's considered, the animals will either repopulate naturally or extend their population into that area, or you can have cap, catch and release. Um, Kind of a good example is the gray wolf in Yellowstone National Park, how, over the last century and a half, they were hunted because they would kill livestock or thought to kill a lot of livestock. So all the excuse me, all of the wolves were extirpated, I mean, they were all shot and killed, mostly in that Yellowstone greater area. And then it was put on the endangered species list in the United States. And then it was decided to reintroduce some into Yellowstone National Park. So at that point, Yellowstone was a fundamental niche for the wolf, but the wolf wasn't there. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service, it's a long, very controversial political process. They took some wolf packs from Canada and they brought them down and released them in Yellowstone. So they knew that that was the right niche for the wolves. The wolves were just missing. So it's an example of a fundamental niche, but the fundamentalness of it was artificially created by humans, first destroying them there. A really cool study done by MacArthur in 1958, also an early ecologist type studying at Princeton. He was just 25, but really insightful. Today we would call them a bird nerd, but someone who is very good at observation and looked at these in some of his doctoral work. He looked at niches and was kind of intrigued by this idea of how species that are really similar and have the same kind of resource needs might be able to coexist. And he was from the New England area, and I don't really know exactly how it happened, but at some point he saw these different warblers that were very similar sized, body shape, very similar areas they live. They live in the same types of trees and utilize the same trees, but they're 5 different species all using the same apparent niche. And he was like, okay, this is a great test of this idea of competitive exclusion. And he observed them enough to gather enough data to see that although it looks like there's 5 very closely related species and similar species all using the same niche, which would go against Gauss's principle, saying they can't, if they're competing for the same stuff, they can't coexist. So that says, well, Gauss's principle is not explaining what we're seeing in these New England warblers. But MacArthur studied them long enough to observe that actually these 5 different species, they had different areas of the tree that they utilized. You can see what's highlighted in yellow, actually what part of the tree they were found most often. So these 5 birds, although they use the same resources and habitats, they have partitioned off these sub niches that were very close to each other, but not the same, just a little bit of overlap. He saw that they actually have utilize different parts of the tree's canopy. The yellow you're seeing, some were at the very bottom of the trees found most of the time, some at the top, some in the middle. They also had slightly different nesting dates, so they wouldn't all nest at the same time in these same trees, different feeding behaviors, and the way they moved in and out of the trees was in different directions. So something, through natural selection, these 5 birds that would require almost the exact same space, time, and food have found a way to all coexist. But if you go back to Hutchinson's idea, it's not the same niche if it's partitioned in that detailed manner. They're actually not using the same niche, but they're using 5 different niches that just at first look like they were the same. Just an example graphic of you could have a plant that has some kind of temperature requirements, like a desert plant can handle higher temperatures, moisture requirement, and the fundamental niche is often bigger. It's the area that that plant could exist, from what we know, and then the realized niche is where it does exist. And again, great applications for conservation and restoration to know the fundamental versus the realized. That means we know a lot about the niche in general, what that plant needs, and we can see where it's potentially could be placed or restored in other areas. Now let's look at the species interaction called predation, where one species benefits from the interaction and one does not. Now you might be thinking of classic examples of, again, Africa, a lion eats a gazelle. The benefit to the lion is it lives and eats, and the detriment to the gazelle is it dies and is eaten. That's a dramatic example. A lot less dramatic is an insect eating a plant. It doesn't kill the plant, but it does harm it somewhat. So that's also considered predation, in other words, called herbivory. And we'll talk a little bit about those both. And there's been a fair amount done mathematically on predator and prey interactions. These equations that were built by two researchers, Dr. Lotka and Dr. Volterra, they were put together and they were based on the logistic growth model equations of population growth, but altered to be able to try to predict how two different species in an interaction will affect each other in this predator-prey interaction. So in our logistic growth model, we've got dn over dt, or the rate of change in the population size over time, equals rn, and n is the actual population size, n times k, which is the carrying capacity minus the actual population size, divided by the carrying capacity. And that k minus n, so you think about it, what's the maximum potential number of individuals in that population that can survive minus the actual? That means that population can still grow. If k minus n is positive, that population can still grow a little more until it gets to k. So that means n is, the population size is below k, it can still theoretically increase. So when n, or the population size, is relatively small, k minus n over k is about 1. When n, the population size, is large, near the carrying capacity, after there's been, like as an example, after there's been a flush of food coming in, maybe spring or resources, then that k minus n over k is about 0. So when we're talking about two different species interacting, k reflects a number that's affected by the intraspecific competition, limiting each species to some degree. So the carrying capacity is going to be different when they're interacting with each other, right? As opposed if they were all by themselves. So also, the two species don't have the same effect on each other. They're different species. So each one in this predation prey relationship, as one is eaten, and that affects the predator to increase its size of its population because it gets more food, that'll affect those species differently. They have different intrinsic growth rates of their own. So these equations incorporate all that information to try to see how they'll affect each other and at what point they could possibly coexist at some kind of stable place, which is really theoretical. So, and I'll show you the equations next. So here are the equations when we're looking at the effects of two species, a predator and a prey, on each other in this type of interspecific competition. The equation for species 1 would be the change in population size over time would equal, you can see the equation there, and that will give you a certain result. And species 2 has its own. The alpha and the beta are added into those equations, which look somewhat similar to the logistic growth model equations, but the alpha and the beta are that the way they affect each other is different. If you have a a lynx, like kind of like bobcat, the whole classic idea of the lynx and the hare. So you've got a lynx, which is like a bobcat, and the rabbits. And the more rabbits it eats, the more the rabbit population goes down, but then the lynx population goes up because it's getting more food, and it gets so big that there's fewer and fewer rabbits, and then there's so few rabbits that the lynx population doesn't have enough food, so it starts to go down, and the rabbit population starts to go back up. Those growth rates of and change of each of those species is different. They're not the same organism. They don't have the same life cycle or gestation period. So that's what the alpha and beta are in there to adjust for the species' different growth rates. I'm not going to say a lot more about it. That's probably more than you wanted to know. We have one more slide, but they're really not that complex of equations. When you're given n, you can go and measure n. K is theoretical but easy to determine, and the alpha and beta are constants that are usually given too. So these are easy to kind of use as theoretical effects of two species on each other. So back to coexistence, plant ecologists have looked at these ideas of competition and coexistence and come up with a couple different hypotheses. Some are equilibrium-based hypotheses where it's assumed the system is in equilibrium. Some are non-equilibrium hypotheses. But they all are trying to answer the question of how can so many different plant species coexist in the same area when they're all using the same water, space, nutrients, sunlight. Seems like they have the same niche. Well, here are some of the ideas that ecologists have come up with, and some of them have been researched and experimentally looked at. The equilibrium hypotheses of why so many plant species can coexist and seemingly use the same niche. They have this idea called niche divergence. It's almost like sharing amongst plants. The niches aren't really exactly the same. If you look close enough, they're somewhat divergent and a little bit different in some way. There's also competitive equivalence, meaning let's say two plants that look like they're competing for the same resources, both should be diminished a little bit in their ability to get that resource because of the other. But if they have equal competitive abilities, then they won't diminish it so much. They both get the exact same amount. It means it's not necessarily slowly eroding at that resource's availability for the other. Differential resource utilization, that's another one. They use the resources differently. That would be a way they could coexist. And David Tillman has done a number of studies to demonstrate how that does occur with plants. The non-equilibrium hypotheses for that same question include disturbance, meaning even if one species, they should be competing, these plants are living in the same spot, they should be competing and diminishing each other's fitness, but a disturbance comes along. A drought, a flood, a landslide, a pest outbreak, heat wave, something happens and it keeps one of the species from overtopping the other. That's how they coexist. Predation, it's kind of like a disturbance, but coming from a biological organism, or migration. Enough said about those. Now let's take a brief look at what predation looks like when it involves plants being eaten. And insects, like this caterpillar eating a plant, is considered plant predation. It's not, again, as exciting as a lion eating a gazelle in the Serengeti, but it is similar. It's in that one organism is eating another and damaging it. It's also called herbivory. So this has been shown through many studies, and I've actually looked at a lot of these studies for some of my graduate student work. Sometimes the herbivory stimulates the plant to grow more in response, like it knows it's being attacked and the plant has a positive overcompensating response. So in that sense, let's think about a grazer like a deer. a deer eating something like sweetgrass. Sweetgrass is a wild plant in the northeastern United States. It's also used a lot by Native Americans up in that area. It smells like vanilla. It's really great smell, but it's also grazed upon by deer. And it's been demonstrated in studies that native people harvesting it in just small percentages at a time, or deer grazing on it a little bit, stimulates it to grow even more. So predation can have a positive effect for both species. That's that positive in the middle there. Otherwise, it can help things like, look back at this caterpillar. It's helping the caterpillar, and in this case, it looks like it's harming that plant. So that would be plus minus. Caterpillars benefiting, the plant has some detriment to it, the negative. And there are some times where that predation doesn't really do that much to the plant. It grows back a little bit after being eaten. It's stimulated to grow, but it doesn't get a burst of growth after being eaten by an insect, and that would be the plus zero. So helps the insect or the grazer, deer, whatever it is, and it's neutral for the plant. Again, that's different than the sweetgrass example, where the grazer or the harvester taking some of the plant makes that plant overcompensate. It makes the plant get bigger in time. That would be the plus plus. Okay, we're on number 3. These will be a little quicker. I'm just giving you some examples of each of these last 4. Amensalism is the next one we're going to talk about. And amensalism is an interaction between two species in two different populations, in which one species is negatively affected and the other is not affected at all. An example would be the black walnut tree. It releases a certain chemical onto the soil through its leaves and other parts of the tree's body that fall, and that inhibits the growth of nearby plants. So it kind of keeps the area under it clear from other plants by producing that juglone chemical. So positive for the tree, negative for another plant that lives under it. That's an amensalism. Here we go. African again example: elephants and small burrowing animals. The elephants disrupt the nests or harm the burrowing animals. But so that's negative for, they're looking for food. They're not looking to eat burrowing animals, but it's negative for those burrowing animals, but it's neutral for the elephant in that just those two species interacting. And penicillium produces the antibiotic penicillin, which inhibits the growth of bacteria. So it's not really doing anything to the penicillin to have them growing together, but it's negative for bacteria in the area. And good thing we figured that one out, huh? Next, number 4, commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other is unaffected. An example of commensalism would be cattle egrets and livestock. As the cattle walk around eating and grazing in a pasture, they stir up insects that the cattle egrets eat. So the cattle egret benefits and the cattle are unaffected. It's not positive or negative for them. Also another example, orchids are called epiphytes. They're plants that live up on top of other plants, usually in tropical areas. That orchid in the picture benefits by having a place to live and some protection. The host tree is unaffected. Nurse plants are another type of commensalism, and that's where you have a seed gets established. It's easier for, especially in drier areas, it's easier for some young seedlings to get established in the shade and protection of an existing bush, or that's the nurse plant. It's kind of a moister, cooler, protected area, and the seeds can grow in there of many different species, and then they usually overtop that nurse plant that they grew up underneath, and then that nurse plant dies out, but is what helped that tree get established. A classic example of a nurse plant syndrome or situation is the saguaro cactus, that often you will see it growing up under the shade of a palo verde tree. So again, the palo verde tree is the nurse plant and provides a protected, shaded, relatively moister environment with a little bit more organic matter in which this young saguaro can sprout and get established. And eventually that cactus gets so big, it competes for the moisture in the soil and space and kills or leads to the death of the Palo Verde host plant. So not a very grateful saguaro to its nurse plant, but that's how it works. Another example from California, closer to home, are blue oaks. They nurse other species. They have this ability to do what's called hydraulic lift. They can tap, their roots can tap into the deep groundwater and bring it up to the shallower areas of the soil and release it. And that releases it to their own shallow water absorbing roots, but also other plants too. So it benefits these other species, this hydraulic lift, but kind of has a neutral effect on itself. Number 5, mutualisms are where two species both benefit from that close interaction. Let's look at an example. Back to the desert for a mutualism example. The phenopepla is a desert bird and it likes to eat the mistletoe seeds. So it benefits positive from that interaction, getting food. And the mistletoe benefits too, because the bird will eat some of those seeds and it can drop seeds to the ground or in other trees. And so it spreads the seeds to new places for the mistletoe to grow. So it benefits that species also. So they both benefit in that mutualism. There's many other examples of mutualisms. This is just one. Last is parasitism, where one of the two organisms in the interaction benefits and the other is negatively harmed. The first thing that always jumps to mind for me is ticks. Ticks are parasites. So is Giardia. Those things, that affect us humans, and I've experienced them. The tick gets on your body, it feeds on your blood, so it is benefiting from that, and you are harmed. Doesn't mean you die, but you're somehow negatively affected by it. But let's go back to another example that we were just talking about for an example of parasitism. And that is back to the example of the mistletoe that grows on the Palo Verde tree. So the mistletoe is a parasite. Its roots go into the tissues of the tree and take out sugars and water nutrients from that tree. So it hurts its host tree. It's a negative for the tree, but it benefits from that interaction. As with most parasites, though, it doesn't benefit the parasite to actually kill your host, because then what are you going to do? So often these trees survive, but they don't look so good. They're not as healthy, but they still hang on, and the mistletoe still gets what it needs. Sometimes parasites can kill the host, but it's usually more at the very end of that whole life cycle or situation of the parasite, and it's not the goal of the parasite theoretically. That ends us this discussion of all these 6 different types of ecological interactions. Again, all of these are important to keep in mind, some of them in the forefront of your mind and some of them in the background when deciding on some particular type of conservation or restoration plan. The more of these interactions we can understand and know about, the more we can plan for them to be restored or hoped to be restored in our restoration plan, so that that system can get back to its original state of complexity, which gives it more resilience and chances for to become a successful restoration.